A retired pilot found her missing plane in the forest. By dawn, armed men had surrounded her cabin. The wreckage shouldn't exist. Not here, not intact, not after 30 years. Captain Victoria Ashford had stopped looking for answers decades ago. But when her hiking trail collapsed beneath her, revealing twisted metal and a tail number she'd never forgotten, everything changed. Inside the fuselage, she found cargo that was never on the manifest. And now, standing at her window watching shadows move through the trees, Victoria realized some crashes are never meant to be found. The morning air in the Bitterroot Mountains was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Victoria Ashford, 68, tied her worn hiking boots with practiced fingers, the same ritual she'd performed thousands of times before. Her fleece jacket hung by the door, faded but reliable, much like everything else in her life these days. Retirement had found her 15 years ago, not by choice but by necessity. After 3 decades of flying commercial routes across the Pacific Northwest, after logging more hours in the cockpit than most pilots dreamed of, her career had ended abruptly. Not with celebration or ceremony, but with a medical grounding that still stung when she thought about it too long. So she'd bought this cabin outside of Missoula, Montana. 40 acres of wilderness, a modest wood frame house with a stone fireplace, and trails that stretched for miles into territory few people ever saw. It was quiet. It was safe. It was hers. Her Belgian Malinois, co-pilot, waited eagerly by the door, tail wagging with barely contained energy. Victoria had named him that as a joke, the only co-pilot she'd ever need now. The dog had been with her for 6 years, ever since she'd found him abandoned at a rest stop. He'd been skinny then, scared, with eyes that understood loss. They'd recognized something in each other that day. All right, Victoria said, grabbing her walking stick. Let's go before you knock the door down. The trail began just past the woodshed, winding up through Douglas fir and lodgepole pine. Victoria had walked it 3, sometimes 4 times a week since moving here. She knew every landmark. The lightning-struck tree at the half-mile mark, the overlook where you could see Lolo Peak on clear days, the creek crossing where co-pilot always stopped to drink. But today, the trail felt different. The autumn storms had been relentless this year. 3 weeks of rain that had turned the mountain slopes into slippery, unstable terrain. Mudslides had closed roads throughout the valley. Search and rescue had been busy pulling hikers out of trouble. Victoria had stayed close to home, waiting for the weather to break. Yesterday, the sun had finally appeared. Today was her first real hike in weeks. Co-pilot ranged ahead, nose to the ground, doing what his breed did best, working, searching, staying alert. Victoria envied his energy. Her knees weren't what they used to be, and her left shoulder ached in cold weather, a souvenir from a rough landing in her 40s that had tweaked something that never quite healed right. She was about 2 miles in when co-pilot stopped. The dog stood rigid, ears forward, staring at a section of trail that looked wrong. The path seemed to sag, as if the earth beneath had become hollow. Fresh cracks spider-webbed across the packed dirt. Co-pilot, heel, Victoria commanded. The dog backed up but kept his eyes fixed on the spot. Victoria approached slowly, testing each step. The ground felt unstable, soft in a way it shouldn't be. She prodded it with her walking stick, and the stick sank deeper than it should have. Then she heard it, a low, ominous creak, like old wood straining under weight. The earth gave way. Victoria lunged backward as a section of trail 20 feet across collapsed inward with a roar. Trees tilted and fell. Rocks tumbled into darkness. Co-pilot barked frantically as Victoria grabbed a tree root and held on while the ground continued to shift and settle. When the dust cleared, Victoria found herself lying on her stomach at the edge of a crater that hadn't existed 30 seconds ago. And at the bottom, partially exposed by the collapse, was something impossible. Metal, curved and corroded, covered in 3 decades of accumulated earth and vegetation, but unmistakable in its shape and purpose. An aircraft fuselage. Victoria's heart stopped, then started again with a painful thud. She'd spent enough of her life around planes to recognize one instantly, even buried and broken. But it was the glimpse of color through the mud, a flash of blue and white paint, that made her blood run cold. Those colors, that stripe pattern. She knew that livery. Descent into mystery, 3 to 6 o'clock. Victoria half-slid, half-climbed down into the crater, her boots finding purchase on exposed roots and rocks. Co-pilot followed, more sure-footed, positioning himself nearby as if standing guard. Her hands shook as she cleared away mud and debris. The metal beneath was cold and solid, pitted with corrosion but structurally intact. Sections of the fuselage had buckled on impact, but large portions remained whole, preserved by the mountain itself. She worked her way along the exposed section, pulling aside vegetation that had grown over and around the wreckage. Moss covered everything. Small trees had taken root in the collected soil. This crash hadn't happened recently. This had been here for years. Decades, even. Victoria found what she was looking for near the tail section. The registration number was partially obscured by dirt, but she scraped it away with her fingernails, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples. N8-173C. The numbers blurred as tears filled her eyes. Flight 173. Denver to Spokane. November 22, 1994. 23 passengers. For crew members. Gone. Victoria had been supposed to fly that route. It was her regular rotation. She'd flown it twice a week for 3 years. But that morning, she'd gotten a call. Her mother had fallen, broken her hip. Victoria had requested emergency leave, and they'd assigned the route to someone else. Captain Helena Brennan, 34 years old. Talented, careful, professional. A pilot Victoria had mentored, had recommended for advancement, had considered a friend. The plane had taken off on schedule. Weather was acceptable, some turbulence expected, but nothing unusual for November in the Rockies. Brennan had checked in with air traffic control twice during the flight, routine communications, no indication of problems. Then, somewhere over Montana, Flight 173 had simply vanished. No mayday, no emergency beacon, no wreckage found despite weeks of searching by the FAA, NTSB, military aircraft, and volunteer search teams. The investigation had consumed months of Victoria's life. She'd reviewed every detail, questioned every decision, replayed every conversation she'd had with Brennan. Survivor's guilt had nearly destroyed her. She should have been flying that plane. Those people should have lived. Brennan should have lived. Eventually, without evidence, the investigation stalled. The official conclusion was catastrophic mechanical failure with subsequent loss of control, but it was speculation. Educated guessing. The families had sued the airline, settled out of court. The media moved on. Life continued. Except for Victoria. She'd never moved on. She'd flown for another 12 years. But something had broken inside her that day. Every flight became an exercise in managing anxiety. Every small mechanical issue became a reminder. Eventually, when the medical examiner found her blood pressure too high, when the stress started affecting her health, she'd let her license lapse. And now, 3 miles from her own cabin, she was standing inside the answer to 30 years of questions. Victoria squeezed through a tear in the fuselage, using her phone's flashlight to see. The interior was a nightmare of decay and preservation. Seats remained bolted in place, their fabric long since rotted away, leaving skeletal frames. Personal items were scattered everywhere, protected from complete decomposition by the sealed environment. A woman's purse, a laptop bag, a child's stuffed bear that made Victoria's chest ache. She moved carefully toward the cockpit, but the forward section had collapsed, crushed by impact, and buried completely. She couldn't reach it. Instead, she turned toward the cargo hold. And that's when she saw them. 6 metal containers, each about 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, secured with heavy-duty straps to the cargo webbing. Unlike everything else in the plane, these containers showed minimal decay. They were sealed units, military-grade construction, with serial numbers stenciled on the sides. Victoria had reviewed the cargo manifest for Flight 173 dozens of times during the investigation. Standard baggage. Mail pouches. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would require specialized containers. These weren't on the manifest. She approached the nearest container and examined the latches. Locked, but the mechanism had corroded. She found a piece of metal debris and used it to pry at the lock. After several attempts, it broke free with a snap. Victoria lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in thick industrial plastic and sealed vacuum bags, were bundles. She carefully opened one of the bags. Cash. Stacks of $100 bills, old but pristine, protected from moisture and decay. Her hands trembled as she checked another bundle. More cash. She opened a second container. Same thing. She estimated quickly. Each container held maybe $500,000. 6 containers meant $3 million. Hidden cargo. Never declared. Never recorded. Victoria sat back, her mind racing. This changed everything. This wasn't just a tragic accident. This was something else entirely. Flight 173 had been carrying undeclared cargo worth millions. Someone had loaded this onto the plane without documentation. Someone had known it was there. And when the plane disappeared, that someone had lost their investment. But why hide it? Why not just ship it legally? Unless it wasn't legal money. Unless it was connected to something criminal. Victoria's thoughts were interrupted by co-pilot's low growl from above. She froze, listening. The dog's growl deepened, becoming more urgent. Victoria quickly closed the containers and climbed back toward the opening in the fuselage. She pulled herself out and found co-pilot standing at the edge of the crater, body rigid, focused on the tree line to the east. Victoria followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. Men. She counted 4 of them, standing in the shadows between the trees about 60 yards away. They weren't hikers or hunters. They wore dark tactical clothing, boots, and each carried equipment. Radios, maybe weapons, she couldn't tell from this distance. One of them raised binoculars and looked directly at her. For 3 long seconds, Victoria stood frozen, staring back. Then, without a word or gesture she could see, the men turned in unison and disappeared back into the forest. The threat materializes 6 to 8 o'clock. Victoria didn't wait to see if they'd return. She grabbed co-pilot's collar and started moving, fast as her aging knees would allow. The trail back to the cabin had never felt so long. Every shadow seemed to hide watchers. Every sound made her flinch. Her mind raced as she moved. Those men hadn't been surprised to see the plane. They'd been watching it. How long had they been out here? How had they known about the crash site? Unless they'd always known. Unless they'd been guarding it. 30 years. Someone had known where Flight 173 went down, and they'd kept it secret. They'd let the families grieve without answers. They'd let the investigation fail, all to protect whatever was in those containers. And now that Victoria had found it, she'd become a problem that needed solving. She reached her cabin in 20 minutes, faster than she'd ever made the hike. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across her property. She locked the front door, closed all the curtains, and went to her landline phone. No dial tone. Victoria checked her cell phone. No signal. That wasn't unusual. Coverage was spotty this far from town, but the timing was too convenient. She went to the window and carefully looked out through a gap in the curtains. At first, she saw nothing but trees and fading daylight. Then movement caught her eye. Men. More than 4 now. She counted at least 10, positioned at various points around her property. They stood just inside the tree line, barely visible, watching her cabin. They weren't approaching. Not yet. Just watching. Waiting. Victoria's military training from her early years kicked in. She'd served 4 years in the Air Force before transitioning to commercial aviation. She quickly took inventory. Her hunting rifle in the closet with 2 boxes of ammunition. Her father's old revolver in the nightstand. Enough food for maybe a week. Water from the well. Firewood stacked outside, but some inside too. She could hold out for a while if necessary. But against 10 armed men? 20? However many they might send? She checked the clock. 7:03 p.m. The sun would set in about 40 minutes. Full darkness in an hour. Victoria sat down at her kitchen table, co-pilot pressed against her leg, and tried to think clearly. She'd found Flight 173. After 30 years, she'd found Helena Brennan and all those passengers. She'd found the truth about what had really happened. And she'd found something else. Something worth killing for. Someone had hidden $3 million on that plane. When it crashed, they'd left it there rather than risk exposure. They'd watched the investigation fail and the case go cold. They'd probably thought the secret was safe forever. Until today, Victoria looked out the window again. The shadows were lengthening, and the men outside weren't leaving. She had until dawn to figure out what to do. And as she watched the last light fade from the sky, Victoria realized she might not survive to see another sunrise. Victoria didn't turn on any lights. She sat in the darkness of her living room, rifle across her lap, watching the shadows outside shift and move. Co-pilot lay at her feet, ears twitching at every sound, occasionally releasing a low growl when movement came too close. The cabin felt smaller now, more exposed. Every window became a vulnerability. Every door a potential entry point. She'd built this place as a sanctuary, a refuge from the chaos of her former life. Now it felt like a trap. Her mind wouldn't stop racing, cycling through the same questions over and over. Who were these men? How had they known about the crash site? And most importantly, why now after 30 years? She thought about Helena Brennan, her friend, her protege, the young pilot who'd taken Victoria's place that November morning. Had Helena known about the cargo? Had she been part of whatever scheme had put $3 million on Flight 173? No. Victoria rejected that immediately. She'd known Helena. The woman had been honest to a fault, principled, careful. If there'd been something wrong with that flight, Helena would have reported it, which meant Helena had been as much a victim as the passengers. Victoria stood and moved to the window, staying to the side, looking out at an angle. The men were still there, positioned in a loose perimeter. She could see the glow of a cigarette about 50 yards out, a small orange point in the darkness. They were patient, professional. This wasn't random violence or opportunistic crime. These were people who knew how to wait, how to watch, how to control a situation. She moved away from the window and went to her bedroom. In the closet, behind boxes of old flight logs and uniforms she couldn't bring herself to throw away, was a footlocker. Victoria pulled it out and opened it. Inside were remnants of her investigation into Flight 173. She'd kept everything. Copies of the official reports, newspaper clippings, her own notes, photographs of the crew and passengers. After the case went cold, she'd boxed it all up, unable to look at it, but equally unable to throw it away. Now she pulled out the files and spread them on her bed, using a small flashlight to read. The passenger manifest. 23 names, ages ranging from 6 to 72. A family of 4 heading to Spokane for Thanksgiving. 2 businessmen. A college student going home. A retired teacher visiting her daughter. Regular people on a routine flight. The crew manifest. Captain Helena Brennan, 34. First Officer James Mitchell, 41. Flight attendants Sarah Chun and Michael Rodriguez, both in their 20s. Victoria had attended all their memorial services, had looked into the eyes of their families and seen their pain, their confusion, their desperate need for answers she couldn't provide. She flipped through the cargo documentation. Standard baggage, registered and weighed. U.S. mail pouches, documented and sealed. Nothing unusual. Nothing that matched the containers she'd found in the wreckage. Someone had loaded that cargo secretly, either at Denver before takeoff or possibly during a refueling stop, though Flight 173 had been scheduled as a direct flight. Victoria pulled out another folder, the maintenance records for the aircraft itself. Boeing 737-300, registration N8-173C, built in 1989, impeccable maintenance history. The last inspection had been 3 days before the crash. Everything had checked out perfectly. She found the weather reports next. Some turbulence expected over the Montana Rockies, but nothing severe. Visibility good. Wind within acceptable parameters. No reason for a crash. The last communication from Flight 173 had come at 10:47 a.m. Mountain Time. Helena's voice on the radio, calm and professional. Denver Center, Cascade 173, level at flight level 280, smooth ride. 60 seconds later, the plane had disappeared from radar. No distress call. No emergency transponder signal. Just gone. Victoria sat back, staring at the papers spread before her. For 30 years, she'd assumed mechanical failure. Catastrophic and sudden. Maybe an engine explosion, a structural failure, something that had happened too fast for Helena to react. But now, knowing about the hidden cargo, other possibilities emerged. What if it hadn't been an accident? What if someone had sabotaged the plane to hide the evidence of the cargo, or to eliminate someone who discovered it? Victoria's hands trembled as she considered this. If Flight 173 had been deliberately brought down, then 27 people had been murdered, and whoever was responsible had gotten away with it for 3 decades. A sound outside made her freeze. Footsteps on gravel, close to the cabin. Co-pilot was on his feet instantly, a low rumble building in his chest. Victoria grabbed the rifle and moved to the front window. Through a gap in the curtains, she saw a figure standing about 20 feet from her porch. Just standing there, waiting. Her heart hammered. She checked the rifle's chamber. Loaded. Safety off. The figure didn't move closer. After a long moment, he raised his hand and gestured, a small wave, almost casual. Then he turned and walked back into the darkness. Victoria's breath came in short gasps. They were testing her, seeing how she'd react, letting her know they could get close anytime they wanted. She checked the clock. 11:34 p.m. Still hours until dawn. This was going to be a very long night. Dawn and the ultimatum, 2 to 4 o'clock. Victoria must have dozed off sometime after 3 a.m., exhaustion finally overwhelming adrenaline. She woke to co-pilot's urgent bark and pale light filtering through the curtains. Dawn. She stood quickly, her back protesting, and moved to the window. The men were no longer hiding in the tree line. They'd formed a semicircle in front of her cabin, about 30 yards out. She counted 14 of them now, all dressed in dark tactical gear, all visibly armed. One man stood apart from the others, directly in front. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He wore a long black coat despite the morning chill not being that severe. As Victoria watched, the man raised a bullhorn to his mouth. Captain Ashford. His voice echoed across the clearing. My name is Malcolm Driscoll. We need to talk. Victoria didn't respond. She stayed behind the curtain, watching. I know you found the plane, Driscoll continued. I know you went inside. I know what you saw. Still, Victoria remained silent. Driscoll lowered the bullhorn and spoke to one of his men. The man pulled out a radio and spoke into it. 30 seconds later, Victoria's landline phone rang. She stared at it. They'd cut the line last night. Now suddenly it worked? The phone rang again. Victoria picked it up, but said nothing. That's better. Driscoll's voice came through, no longer using the bullhorn. I prefer civilized conversation. Civilized men don't surround people's homes with armed thugs, Victoria said. Fair point. But then, civilized pilots don't steal classified cargo from crash sites. I didn't steal anything. Driscoll's expression hardened. You're out of your depth, Captain Ashford. You don't know who you're dealing with. Then tell me, who are you working for? People who don't leave loose ends. Victoria felt her hand move toward the revolver at her belt. So I'm a loose end now? Just like everyone on that plane was a loose end. Driscoll shook his head slowly. This doesn't have to end badly. We can still make a deal. Captain, that's very foolish. You're outnumbered 14 to 1. Then you'd better hope you're not the one I shoot. Everyone turned. Men in FBI tactical gear emerged from the tree line. At least 20 of them, rifles raised, surrounding Driscoll's group. Victoria blinked in confusion. Where had they come from? Victoria lowered her revolver, her heart still racing, trying to understand what was happening. The FBI agent approached the porch as her team secured the area. She was in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back and sharp, intelligent eyes. Captain Ashford? I'm Special Agent Kimberly Torres, FBI. Are you all right? Ah, yes. How did you? Torres smiled slightly. Your cabin has been under surveillance for the past 2 weeks, Captain. We've been investigating Malcolm Driscoll and his organization for 8 months. When you found that plane yesterday, we knew he'd make a move. We've been positioned out here since midnight, waiting for him to incriminate himself. Victoria's legs suddenly felt weak. She sat down heavily on the porch steps. You knew about the plane? You knew it was out there. We suspected. We had reports of Driscoll's men making regular trips into this area, but we didn't know what they were guarding. When the mudslide exposed the wreckage and you discovered it, everything accelerated. Torres sat down next to Victoria. We have a lot to talk about, Captain. But first, are you injured? Do you need medical attention? No, I'm... Victoria stopped. Wait, you said you've been investigating for 8 months. Why didn't you tell me the plane was out here? Torres's expression grew somber. We didn't know for certain until yesterday. And Captain, I need to be honest with you about something. The investigation into Flight 173 never really closed. It's been ongoing for 30 years. Just, very quietly. Victoria stared at her. What are you talking about? Thomas Hartwell, the DEA agent on that plane? He wasn't just any agent. He was deep undercover in a major drug trafficking operation. He'd infiltrated an organization moving hundreds of millions of dollars through the western states. The money on that plane was part of it, $3 million being transported from Denver to Spokane as payment for a shipment. Victoria felt sick. He discovered they were using commercial flights to move money. Yes, and he reported it to his handlers the day before Flight 173 took off. He said he had evidence, said he was going to expose the whole operation. That flight was supposed to be his last assignment before extraction. Torres paused. Instead, the plane went down, and the DEA suspected sabotage immediately. Then why didn't they investigate? Why let it be ruled an accident? Because they didn't want to tip off the people responsible. The organization Hartwell was investigating was powerful, with connections in government, law enforcement, even the FAA. If the DEA had pushed for a sabotage investigation, the guilty parties would have scattered and hidden evidence. So they waited, built their case slowly, identified everyone involved. Torres gestured toward Driscoll, who was being handcuffed, and led away. Malcolm Driscoll was Hartwell's handler, his supervisor in the DEA. Victoria's blood ran cold. His own handler killed him. Driscoll was corrupt, working for the very people Hartwell was investigating. When Hartwell reported what he'd found, Driscoll arranged for the plane to be sabotaged. A small explosive device in the cargo hold, timed to detonate over the mountains where the wreckage would be impossible to find. He then volunteered to lead the search effort, making sure no one looked in the right places. 27 people died because one man was corrupt, Victoria said, her voice hollow. Yes, and for 30 years, Driscoll thought he'd gotten away with it. He retired from the DEA, went private, continued working for the trafficking organization. He's been guarding that crash site ever since, making sure the evidence stayed buried. Torres stood. But evidence has a way of surfacing eventually. Your discovery yesterday gave us everything we needed to finally arrest him. Victoria looked at the FBI agents securing the scene, processing Driscoll's men, photographing everything. What happens now? She asked. Now we recover those containers, excavate the crash site properly, and give the families of Flight 173 the answers they've deserved for 3 decades. Torres offered Victoria a hand and helped her to her feet. And Captain, I want you to know, Thomas Hartwell's family has been waiting for this day. They knew he was working a dangerous case. They suspected something went wrong, but they never had proof. Now they will. Victoria felt tears forming. Helena Brennan, the pilot who took my place. She had no idea what she was flying into. No, none of the crew did. They were innocent victims, just like the passengers. It should have been me, Victoria said quietly. I was supposed to fly that route. Torres looked at her with compassion. Then you would have died too, Captain. And Malcolm Driscoll would still be free. Sometimes things happen the way they're meant to. Victoria wasn't sure she believed that. But standing here now, watching justice finally arrive 30 years late, she felt something shift inside her. The guilt she'd carried for so long. Maybe it was time to let it go. Co-pilot barked from inside the cabin, reminding Victoria he was still there. She smiled slightly. I should let my dog out before he tears the place apart. Of course. We'll need to take your statement, but that can wait a bit. There are some people who want to meet you, though. Who? Torres gestured toward the road. Victoria saw vehicles approaching, regular cars, not law enforcement. The families, Torres said. When word got out that the plane had been found, some of them drove through the night to be here. They wanted to thank the person who finally gave them closure. Victoria watched the cars pull up, saw people emerging, older now, weathered by 3 decades of grief, but with something like hope in their eyes. She wasn't ready for this. Didn't know what to say. But as the first family approached, a woman in her 60s with tears streaming down her face, Victoria realized that maybe no words were needed. Thank you, the woman said simply, taking Victoria's hands. My daughter was on that plane. She was only 19. Now I can finally bring her home. Victoria nodded, her own tears falling now. I'm so sorry. For all of it. You found her. After all this time, you found her. That's all that matters. More families gathered, and Victoria stood among them, accepting their thanks, sharing their pain, feeling the weight of 30 years begin to lift. The sun had fully risen now, burning away the morning fog, revealing the Bitterroot Mountains in all their stark beauty. Somewhere out there, hidden in those mountains, was Flight 173. The dead would finally be recovered. The truth would finally be known. And Malcolm Driscoll would finally pay for what he'd done. Justice had taken 3 decades to arrive, but it had arrived.